the second part of this day. My name is Paolo Campana. I'm a lecturer here at the University of Criminology, University of Cambridge, Institute of Criminology. What we're going to do now, we're going to listen for four distinguished speakers about their reaction to the paper that we just heard. So the first speaker, let me introduce Professor Larry Sherman, also from the Institute of Criminology at the University of Cambridge, and director of the Center for Experimental Criminology. So, Larry, thank you very much for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So let me begin by thanking Daniel and Rob for thinking about these very important questions and for taking the time to be with us today and extending the conversation that began in a very well-attended session at the American Society of Criminology last year. I don't know whether we're going to have to keep doing this every year, Daniel, because it's raising so many interesting issues. I would like to just briefly mention that I think there's plenty of bathwater in this discussion that needs to be thrown out. The overstatement of certainty as to what we've learned from many randomized field experiments is certainly a prominent one to remove. Daniel and I, 15 years ago, were discussing the impact of restorative justice experiments that diverted people from prosecution and how that might affect not just specific deterrence, but also improve crime prevention by not sanctioning people in ways that are good for their criminal career, but it might be bad for general deterrence and as a system-wide effect of having policies of diversion. We have to be very sensitive to the potential impact of what is good for individuals and even victims in particular crime situations might be bad for the community in the long run, depending on the dynamics of general deterrence, which we don't really understand very well either. And so we would need, in fact, to address that with different kinds of experiments, from the classic field experiment with individuals as the units of analysis, or even places as the units of analysis. With respect to hotspots policing, which is what I'm going to focus on, because I think the arguments are pretty powerful with the MTO focusing on the individual and then raising the questions that Rob has raised about, well, it may be good or bad for individuals, but what about the system effects on whole neighborhoods? With respect to hotspots policing experiment, I think the most important issue that creates uncertainty in our counterfactual world, which they haven't addressed, is the idea of what's in the control group. And in fact, there's not a single replication of a hotspots policing experiment. The first one started with 7% of the control group time having a police car present, and the experiment created 15%. So that was the ratio that we began with. And then in my recent review of how much patrol is in the control group, there's a vast range. And in fact, I'm going to show you a new experiment that Barack Ariel has under review with me and the former deputy chief of British Transport Police that looked at no treatment controls and the effect that has on estimating the effect size and the benefit. I think that is probably the number one issue challenging hotspots experiments, quite apart from the system level effects. But I do want to say that the overall effect of an argument like this on the uninitiated might be to interpret it as you can't draw conclusions from experiments, and that would be the baby that could be discarded with the rid of bathwater. And I'd like to demonstrate some ways in which we can be very clear that system effects are not the only important questions, and that you can ask questions that may not have knock-on system effects if you're using designs that haven't been used in the past, although the first proposal to do so was 50 years ago, and which the Western Australian police have gotten around to completing in the past year, and I'll tell you about that as well as a demonstration of how you can answer an important question even without knowing a system-level effect about it because of the nature of the experiment. What we can say is that a system effect is a gold question, but it's not the only gold question to be addressed. So who is the baby that I'm concerned about? Well, there they are. Those are all of our brand new apprenticeships, senior leader, Masters of Studies students in the Applied Criminology and Police Management course taken in mid-April at the end of their first block. These are people who are dead keen to do research on what works in policing, not just experiments, all three of the T's, the targeting through big data algorithms and rigorous assessment of false positives and false negatives and predictions, as well as tracking what the police are doing, such as the fact that they're actually in the police stations more than 50% of the time, and so the reverse interference might actually have a lot of slack to absorb in the hotspots policing experiments. These are people who are now numbering over 500 graduates worldwide. We'd like to have more programs like the one at Cambridge. So far, there aren't any, but what the people who come out of the program do with the Triple T has been, among other things, to create societies of police professionals who are having meetings in various places, most recently at the Royal Society in London, where the Mother Society here in the UK of several thousand police officers who are keen about using research and experiments to improve policing are generating similar societies in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the USA, as well as agency units. New Zealand has just created a unit with 40 officers and analysts. It's led by somebody who just finished his master's at Cambridge. They've just hired somebody else who had been in the West Midlands Police, who's run several of his own hotspots experiments, including the one I'll show you in a minute. And body-worn video is one of the biggest revolutions in policing. Actually began in B3, that room, when we were talking about how you design an experiment to test it, and Chief Tony Farrar of Rialto, California, did it with Brock Ariel as his supervisor, Alex Sutherland, who's here from RAND, as a co-analyst in the case. And it's now been downloaded over 60,000 times since it was published in the Journal of Quantitative Criminology. Now we have our own journal, so there's lots of enthusiasm, and the best measure with respect to today's discussion is Peter Nayrud's tracking of the number of randomized controlled trials. This is actually as of the end of 2017, beginning 2018. Peter's here. What if you include the ones in flight? Are we up to 250 about at this point? So there's a lot of activity going on, and a lot of it is actually challenged by a number of the issues we've heard about today. But I think everybody who's engaged in these experiments they're all learning a lot from the experience of trying to create the counterfactual worlds. And every time there's a treatment misassignment, every time there's problems with treatment and integrity or compliance, the kinds of things Angus Deaton was talking about, they recognize the difficulty of creating those counterfactual worlds. Incidentally, most of the recent growth in the trials has been in the UK, and I think it's a real compliment to the British Police Service to see the extent to which, for whatever reasons, they have embraced this, and especially in the areas of hotspots policing, where they have combined it with new measures of crime, including crime seriousness, which is another major issue for any crime impact policy, to get away from the traditional prevalence or frequency counts as if all crimes are created equal. And so virtually all of the new experiments that are being done in relation to the Cambridge course are using these measures, and a lot of them are looking at the question of residual deterrence, which some of you will recognize from Chris Coper's curve of residual deterrence, published in 1995, showing that the longer the police stayed up through 10 minutes in a hotspot, the longer the period of residual deterrence after they left the scene, in terms of how long it took before the first crime was observed by our graduate student social science observers, for whom we had a full employment act during the course of that experiment. And with the 30-minute follow-up, we see that there was a substantial drop in the risk of anything occurring after the police left. if they had been there for at least about 10 minutes. But is 30 minutes the right length? Well, that's all Chris could look at because that's the way the forms were collected. But the other limitations of that finding is that it was only one city. It's a correlation. The lengths of time weren't randomly assigned. And there weren't any crime-harm index data. Not all of those problems are solved by the London Underground experiment that Barack Ariel led. But what was created in that experiment was, to my knowledge, the first zero treatment control group. And if you think about it conceptually, the impact of having no treatment, like if you're comparing 1,000 people who take 2 aspirins and 1,000 people who take a half an aspirin every night, well, that tells you something about the difference in dosage. But wouldn't you rather have an experiment with 1,000 people with no aspirin compared to the 2 aspirins? And that's, in effect, this is the first time we've got the no aspirin. We have these platforms having, according to many interviews, no proactive patrol in uniform. The only time police get on these platforms in uniform is to get on a train and go someplace or to respond to a call for service. They're basically unpoliced, and yet, when we introduced regular patrols, 15 minutes at a time, 4 times within 7 hours on 4 days a week, what we found was massive residual deterrent effects. The platforms that were getting the patrols during those 7 hours had a standardized difference in means using a calls for service measures. It's less for reported crimes, but it was a much bigger effect size than any previous hotspot experiment had found. If you look at the rest of the hours of the day when there was patrol, the effect size is almost as big. And if you look on days when they didn't have any patrol at all, but during the same hours when the patrol was regularly provided, you're still getting a substantial effect size, even though they went 3 days a week in a row without any patrol. If you then look at the non-patrol days and not in the patrol hours, you're still getting that residual effect. If you want to look at the opposite of displacement, which is often called diffusion of benefit, we like to call it regional deterrence, you're also getting deterrence throughout the tube stations in London. In the 57 that received these patrols 4 days a week compared to the 57 that didn't get any patrols at all. So what we see here is a massive amount of deterrence from the police having been there very little, and looking at what's left over, our estimate is that 6% of all of the crime deterred in this experiment, or that didn't happen in the treatment group, was during those 7 hours a day when the police kept coming and going for 15-minute patrols. 94% of it was outside of that time and place boundary. That is to say, going to the whole tube station. How much of this is due to, 15 Romanian pickpockets? I don't know. And it's entirely possible that we've got to get the study of criminal networks much more centrally located in understanding the causal mechanisms of hotspots patrol. But I think it's important to understand the paradox of police preventing more crime when they're not there than when they are, because of what that means in terms of systematically getting police to certain places for at least a little bit of time. And the system effect, this idea that we could somehow have optimization of all hotspots getting lots of patrol all the time, is something that's very unlikely to occur in my experience, because of the great difficulty in delivering any hotspots patrol to officers who really don't have a full understanding and certainly have never been persuaded to do something that they like to call evidence-based parking, which is essentially, in their view, a meaningless exercise because nothing ever happens and therefore it can't be working, except prevention is, shall we say, defined that way. We can't know about that through parallel track experiments, which is what all of them have been so far. in the original design by R.A. Fisher, his 1931 book, The Design of Experiments. He also referred to crossover experiments. And if what we do is to take the idea of police presence as being something that's unpredictable and constantly rotating, we might be able to leverage a lot more residual deterrence. So how would we know that? Well, in 1990, I suggested a research design. Dan commented on it in his 1998 Crime and Justice piece about why constant rotation makes theoretical sense in relation to the ambiguity of version evidence in economics. And if the offenders discover that they have been fooled, maybe it'll wear off, but how long does that take? Well, for 248 days, Jeff Barnes and Simon Williams in Western Australia took 15 hotspots that were randomly assigned every day to either treatment or control. And following a modified version of the logic that Steve Feinberg, Al Rees, Kinley Lawrence suggested in 1976, by having the hotspots be both experimental and control, we created much more of a real-world system, if you will, for patrolling without comparing it to hotspots that didn't get any patrols during this time period, which might be another version of the design. But one of the things that you do when you sort these places to about 1/3 of them getting a patrol every day and the other 2/3 not, is this distribution of the number of days that you've gone without a patrol or the number of days that you get a patrol consecutively. And it's the consecutive distribution by random assignment that creates the most stunning finding from this experiment, which is that if you look just at the prevalence of crime with the treatment days compared to 1, 2, 3, or 4 days of no patrol, there's not a whole lot of difference. Crime prevalence goes up a bit. And then if you look at 5 or more days without patrol, the difference gets larger, but not nearly as much difference as you see with frequency in terms of a nonlinear tipping point of 4 days, showing you that after 4 days without a patrol, since the last patrol, all hell is breaking loose. And if you look at the crime harm index, it's about 5 times higher. So to find that out, to tell the patrol administrators that if you don't have patrol in your hotspots for 4 days, you're going to have a big spike in crime. That, to me, is a gold answer. It may not be the question we asked, because it wasn't. We were just asking the question of how long did the deterrence last. But to find out that there's this sharp tipping point, because this experiment told us that, I think is something that can be put into practice right away. So just to skip through to the final point, if what we can learn from within city experiments is unanticipated serendipitous discoveries about something to do with the hottest hotspots, which wouldn't then have implications for less hot hotspots, because this is where we're focusing, and this is where we're looking at when same places either do get patrolled or don't, when we ask the question, what difference does it make for those particular places? It seems to me that's a very useful gold standard question for Perth, Australia, even if it doesn't address a lot of the other issues that have been raised. I think those are important issues. I think this is also an important issue that allows us to go into perhaps the quasi-experimental design of having the random assignment of patrols as a policy rather than as a research design. A counterfactual world in which, as I said in 1990, the criminals never know where the cops are going to be or when, and they just have to keep guessing, and we may be able to keep driving the residual deterrence levels up. So the baby that is not the bathwater for me is using research locally, as Sampson, Winship, and Knight suggested, in terms of the emphasis on context, and applying local research for local translation, and then tracking its success to see if prevention decay sets in, or deterrence decay, diagnosing the patterns of failure, and then designing a new test. That's a kind of research-based policing, which is not unlike individual patient medicine. as distinct from the bathwater, which is this idea that we have to test a national policy, like everybody gets MTO, everybody has to do hotspots policing. One size fits all, mandatory arrest, mandatory sentencing, anything that restricts professional discretion restricts the progress of science and the capacity to learn through trial and error. Who wants that bathwater? Not me. Just give me the baby, like my 6-month-old grandson. Thank you very much.